Call of Duty Black Ops 3 makes a lot of speculations about the future of warfare that seem wild, but are grounded in the modern day. So what I want to do is piece out as much of it as I can, asking whether these things are possible, and what they say about where we're going. Technological development in the military these days is largely in response to the dramatic advance of irregular warfare, with insurgents and terrorists instead of state-sponsored armies. This is really where Black Ops 3 comes in, because you play as some kind of Black Ops soldier, the kind specifically designed for cutting-edge counterterrorism. This soldier, male or female, is part of an unidentified squad, which at one point early on an NPC refers to as Black Ops. Now, years ago, this would have really screwed me up because I always thought that Black Ops referred to a physical branch of the military, that it wasn't more of a de facto classification to certain special operations missions. And in fact, when the game begins proper, you are part of a CIA attaché, and although that branch of government doesn't have the monopoly on clandestine missions, it's easy for average American citizens like myself to conflate the two, given the nature of the CIA's work and the nature of the War on Terror. But I've come to understand the term Black Ops in relation to the term Special Forces, which itself is part of a greater classification known as Special Operations Forces, which includes the Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Air Force Special Operations Pilots, Delta Force, and the U.S. Army Special Forces. The U.S. Army Special Forces, which is probably where your character comes from, was in real life founded in 1952 as an adaptation of the Office of Strategic Services, which dropped paratroopers behind enemy lines in World War II. Their missions oftentimes involved organizing local resistance groups. As the nature of warfare changed following World War II, there was a lobbying for this kind of military service by one Colonel Aaron Bank, who is considered the father of the Special Forces. The idea is that war is fought on multiple fronts, and not physical ones necessarily, but through a variety of tactics and responses to enemy patterns, propaganda, economic warfare, along with more traditional military action. Now, Call of Duty Black Ops 3 is a 2015 video game by Treyarch, released primarily for the PS4, Xbox One, and PC, although additions for last-gen hardware do exist, albeit with significant reductions in content. Be forewarned if you haven't made the jump to next-gen yet, because the 360 and PS3 versions do not have the single-player campaign. And the single-player campaign is going to be the focus of this episode because, as media to be analyzed, it is the most directed or perhaps authored experience in the whole package. There's been plenty written about how our media's depiction of war doesn't capture a fraction of the ground troops' reality, whether the tension or intensity, or the basic intimacy of the experience that war movies have to zoom out and show the expensive set piece from a distance. Historically, soldiers are not privileged to that bird's eye vantage, and the one they have instead is incredibly claustrophobic and confusing. Of course, my argument there is that the most creative among creators are then tasked with inventing better narrative methods of relaying the themes surrounding this concern about reality, which probably regards anti-war messages. And if not the extreme of anti-war, then at least a better representation, so that greater America might begin to understand what it's like. One example here is the movie Apocalypse Now, which may not be the most realistic war movie, but it is arguably the most artistic, and that's a better method to the end game. As a full narrative then, it also just treats the medium of film as a mode of expression, rather than a delivery system for a type of experience, like Black Hawk Down. Not to say that either approach is inherently better or worse, but they do yield different results, just a matter of what you're in the mood for. The popular understanding of war these days is that it's marked most extensively by periods of boredom, which are oftentimes punctuated by life-threatening violence. This doesn't really sound like the kind of thing you can capture in a video game, especially one like Call of Duty, but the Black Ops series depicts Black Ops, rather than something like Patrol, so you're always dropping in from a helicopter, or a VTOL in this case, into an exciting combat zone, always on a mission. And in between you're hanging out at the CIA safe house, which is where you can upgrade weapons and powers, but still, that's the extent of the experience. It's day and night, rather than a fuller spectrum, though this could very well have to do with the true nature of the story. No spoilers in this podcast. But I'm still not quite satisfied with that, and it's because of that spectrum with regards to Special Forces operations. You're not going to capture the boredom or the intensity, but there's a certain variety to Special Forces work that is absent in Black Ops 3 that is decidedly not paralleled by the variety in those RPG superpowers you get, most of which are just repeats from BioShock Infinite. Not that I can really begrudge any heartfelt attempt to shake up the shooter formula or reach for that brass ring that is the Vanguard class in Mass Effect 3. I mean, we've got to get something from this unremitting RPG diaspora across all video game genres. Soldiers are recruited to the various special operations branches because they're multidisciplinary. The development of special operations forces has evolved through time and through trial and error, adapting in response to the enemy, and being defined in spite of the complications of overlapping jurisdictions and political interests. Sometimes all they'd have is theory, and so on the field, these soldiers have to solve problems by creative means. And that really sounds like a good paradigm on which to stage a work of interactive fiction, and plenty of games do that. They allow the player to strategize on the field, but even open-world games of the past few years like Metal Gear Solid 5 and the Witcher series, by design cannot express the fullness of this real-world creativity. They're doing different things, telling different stories, which in themselves are much more rooted in their literary genres, being sci-fi and fantasy respectively. Something like Call of Duty can be a blank slate for ideas, being reset every now and then for the new sub-series. A sub-series like Black Ops could really deconstruct the nature of covert operations, the kind paradoxically governed by Title 50 of US law, those directed by the CIA and overseen by Congress, but whose existence is denied. Not that they're always automatically morally challenged, as is typical in military fiction for the sake of drama, but that they're politically sensitive and complicated. I like to quote directly from the book I'm getting all this from, called Masters of Chaos. Open quote, "Communist insurgencies learned long ago, for example, to co-opt teachers' unions and health workers because they reach so much of the population and provide ideal recruiting tools for fighters and underground auxiliaries. The co-opting of students in Islamic religious schools, known as madrasas, simply is the same method used by another group seeking to impose its vision of political religious rule. The specific methods, entities, and guidelines adopted require careful deliberation and a response, likely by a combination of spies, warriors, and diplomats, that is tailored to each particular circumstance." Close quote. A series like Call of Duty is so long-running and profitable that you'd think they could experiment more. The gameplay has stayed relatively consistent since 2003, and the ambition of the series amounts to headline grabbers like No Russian, and the involvement of major Hollywood stars like Kevin Spacey, Michael B. Jordan, and Christopher Maloney. You're always playing an infantryman of some kind, but in special forces and in covert ops, I feel like the infantrymen have a greater sense of command, because you're out there on your own. But instead the Black Ops series uses the idea as window dressing for the same experience. It's kind of like the movie The Purge, which builds itself up on this ridiculous premise, but uses it only to round back to something that really didn't require that premise. So that's a complaint that might seem big, but wasn't so much in the actual playing of the game. I think it would be cool though, and it would be immersion. Not just because NPCs like the native locals would become more of an element, and you'd really feel like you were part of this foreign land, but because you'd have to exhibit a range of qualities. They say that human perception, finesse, and judgment are the difference with Special Forces soldiers. And to contrast directly with those very human characteristics which make soldiers so ideal, one of the speculations depicted in Black Ops 3 is artificial intelligence. There's a plot point later on in the campaign that involves a gestalt intelligence, like a hive mind, but early on it's no spoiler to say that robots are a part of this game, and they're driven more by AI. A brutal, uncaring AI that is somehow sadistic enough to rip soldiers limb from limb instead of, one to the head, one to the heart. Believe it or not, artificial intelligence is something that people are talking about right now, and have been seriously for a few years. I think the scene where your character gets delimbed by the robot is actually an accurate summation and reflection of those fears, though it is perhaps ungraceful in being so. But we have media like The Terminator, that put the idea of killer robots into the public conversation, and now we have UAVs, or drones, which are a constant source of controversy, but maybe rightfully so. In this age of irregular warfare, again, we're not really fighting against fellow states, but instead networks of people, like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, and because they are insurgents, they hide among the civilian populace of places like Iraq and Pakistan and Syria. Drone strikes theoretically allow the US military to surgically eliminate high-value targets without a risk to US soldiers nor the local civilians. But the controversy comes from the eliminations that aren't so surgical, as well as the culture of fear that killer robots in the sky naturally instills. Civilians in Pakistan are afraid of the sky itself because you look up and you don't see anything, but you know something's there, and that it can kill you with little accountability and an integrity of intelligence that is laughable by the historical standards of the US military. And so what these drones represent is unchecked power, one with a religious flavoring to it because it's like fire from the sky. Do we trust our government with that power? Our government, which already uses drones to spy on people in the US, erecting a huge one-way mirror over the world like the mothership in Independence Day. And on that control console with a big screen that shows you Google Earth in real time, you have right next to it the big red button. If you can trust them. The next question is, can you trust something even more faceless? And that's AI. We have drone pilots right now, but the next step is setting those things loose and letting them make decisions on who to take down. Removing the human element is a humane concession to the realities of post-traumatic stress disorder, but it also expresses something deeply inhuman, along with what is literally inhuman. And so the ideal battlefield unit is the human soldier, whether Marine infantryman or part of the 12-man Special Forces unit, because, as we know, warfare is more than engaging the enemy in a firefight. It's a lot more complicated than that, and if we have to boil it down to a concise definition, we would at least say that it's a human interaction, that there is communication and decision-making involved. Artificial intelligence currently does not have the finesse of soldiers trained to engage with the nuances of the ever-unpredictable battlefield. You can program a whole lot, but some things have to be earned through human experience. Black Ops 3 does a good job of making the distinction between man and machine here, whether it's in praise of human soldiers or a more Luddite criticism. It's hard to say, but the effect is still the same, and that's all that matters. We gotta take these things slowly, but the thing that really gets me about the robot soldiers in this game is what put the lie to the gameplay, especially in the context of other shooters. I'll come clean, I am an Xbox guy. My games were Halo and Gears of War, and I didn't always play Call of Duty when they came out every year. I didn't really get it at the time, but part of the problem was that you're always shooting human soldiers, and so what that amounts to is a sameness in experience. Take Halo, for example. You have the dynamics of the Covenant squad, with the elite hanging back, the grunts moving forward, and the jackals sniping at you from all angles. You take different strategies to different enemy types, and their uniqueness is visually represented. Even in Gears of War, whose enemies were largely more humanoid, there was still a lot of variety there, especially as the series went on. So where Black Ops 3 treats the robot soldiers as part of the world building, it's still a video game, and so what it's doing, maybe by accident, is introducing an enemy type. But the thing functions basically the same as the human soldier, although you can use different powers on it, and they take more bullets to go down. Given the sheer volume of enemies that appear in any one encounter, that's actually an unwelcome change. Alright, so let's see what the next thing is. How about the utility of cybernetic enhancement on the battlefield? If we combine the prior two sections, Special Forces and Robots, we get cyborg super soldiers. This is something that's actually been a part of military science fiction for years, which is logical, but it's also been a part of military science. The question is the same for futurists and weapon manufacturers both. How do we enhance the human soldier, which as we know is still the most versatile unit on the battlefield? In recent days, and with Call of Duty especially, those two parties kind of joined forces, where the creators of games like Ghost Recon and the more futuristic Call of Duty games speak with people in the know, and design the guns and armors and gadgets from there. We've talked about Special Forces, and they represent the cutting edge of combat, which is what's primarily depicted in these games. So, how do you iterate on that? How do you make the best of the best even better? Well, the reason they're the best is because they're optimized for each situation. Terrorism begets counterterrorism, and although it's a largely unpredictable strategy, there are points of contact to design around. So in a futuristic speculation, you have to change the nature of the situation and then optimize your soldiers for that. What is the situation in Black Ops 3? We're treated to a little world-building montage in the beginning, the classical kind, with narration over a facsimile of news footage. We learn that the world is in the shitter because of climate change and civil unrest. The big change from Black Ops 2 to this game is the introduction of those robot soldiers, and this has seemingly prompted a response in human soldiers who tech themselves out like RoboCop. That's exactly what happens to you, the player character. At the end of the first mission in the game, you and your comrades help get a prisoner of war to safety in an LZ under fire. You're accidentally left behind, and as alluded to earlier, one of those robot soldiers breaks your leg and rips both your arms off as you scream and survey your bloody stumps one after the other. You're brought back to life, again like RoboCop, as part man, part machine. Your ostensible CO, Taylor, remarks that it's ironic how terrorist attacks paved the way for advancements in the interface system, or the cyborg technology, that we wouldn't have cybernetic soldiers without fear of these attacks. That framework based on fear, of course, peaked in the Cold War, which is our go-to example for this sort of thing, but this case is slightly different. It's the somber reflection that indeed, there's almost an ecosystem of innovation between terrorism and counterterrorism. It's fascinating looking through various strange pockets of human history just how much of human development came inadvertently or accidentally. The field of cognitive neuroscience is my prized example for that. Like, we wouldn't know anything about the human brain if traumatic injuries hadn't happened to people. Which makes sense because who's going to experiment on the brain of a living person, but I don't know, I guess it's just that some things are out of reach for civilized people until an external force intervenes. Up until the modern days media landscape, speculation regarding advanced warfare, let's call it, was rooted in classical science fiction thought processes. Powered armor from Robert Heinlein is one such invention, and you can kind of logically see where that would come from based on the central what-if mentality of sci-fi. How would we better empower soldiers? And from there you get other scientific concerns like genetic engineering and psychotropic enhancements. But in this modern-day media landscape, we're applying that foundation to something very real, as gadget culture sees everyday people becoming more interested in technology, and warfare has a less destabilizing effect on consumer societies, to use the academic phraseology of Macadamia 4. The soldiers in Black Ops 3 are cyborgs, and this correlates to a lot more than the simpler considerations of a battlefield like Starship Troopers. So let's see what they can do. The first thing you notice is the robot parts, where the player character is eviscerated and then rebuilt. I actually kind of had like a visceral reaction to the moment where you look at your hands and you see that they're robotic, which is not an uncommon scene in Cyberpunk, but maybe because of the graphical fidelity, I guess this time I was just more receptive to the horror of the idea that to look at those fingers, you know there's just a nuance of physical sensitivity you'll never have again, and you have to relearn the basics of motor control. I mean, like, what would that be like? Not only the basics then, but also the advanced course, which involves running on walls like Titanfall, and probably enhanced stamina and strength. That part of it is sometimes understated in games like these, because all video game characters are superpowered in some way. Sometimes it's part of the fiction, like how the Master Chief can flip a warthog, but sometimes your very human soldier guy can just take a clip of bullets in the legs and duck behind cover to regenerate health. And then the limits of superpowers conflict with gameplay, right? Only a few brave games let you loose with a full run of powers because you don't want to just be sitting there grinding it out. But sometimes cooldowns on those powers are a real boner killer, like the batteries in Deus Ex Human Revolution, or the situation in a game like Crysis 2, which I found was just completely about sneaking around while invisible, even though I was supposedly in a suit of powered armor. So for Black Ops 3, you do have a cooldown, and I think that for the most part the super strength is that same kind of understated. You feel like an enhanced badass in this game, but you have since Call of Duty 1. So the difference is contextualization, and you decide how much that ultimately matters. There have been real-world experiments with human super strength, and usually it's less traumatic than the involvement of replacement limbs. Take a look at the HULC, H-U-L-C acronym that stands for Human Universal Load Carrier, developed by Professor H. Kazuruni and licensed by Lockheed Martin. It's designed to carry up to 200 pounds, and the innovation is in the load management, as the weight of the object that you pick up kind of spreads through the metal frame that you're sitting in, designed to handle it. If you're looking for something more science fictional, well, you might as well look to Japan, right? And you might as well look to the company that named itself Cyberdyne. Cyberdyne the robot company. That's a real place, it's a real company in Japan. Name was not meant to be a reference to Cyberdyne from Terminator 2, the company that ultimately developed Skynet. I tell you, when the nukes fall in 2019, they'd better have a damn good PR department. But anyway, their product is the HAL, Hybrid Assistant Limb, and HAL, of course, is also the name of an evil AI from science fiction film, but we'll let that one go. This powered exoskeleton is actually for medical, not military application, but unlike the Hulk and the myriad other military exoskeletons out there, this one has actually seen wide usage. It's pretty interesting. But of course, in sci-fi, cyborg technology and powered suits are two different things. One is Neuromancer, the other is Starship Troopers. But cyborg technology, while achieving a similar goal in the military, is a more daunting prospect. I mean, just think about it. Would you voluntarily become a cyborg if it meant you couldn't go back? Masturbation jokes aside, the question would at least give you a moment of pause. But even if we do get over that initial hurdle, this prospect raises further questions. Once implemented, what effect will cyborg technology like this have on soldiers in a conceptual sense? Won't it make elite soldiers like those featured in Black Ops kind of a nullified classification, if every soldier is on the same level? Makes you really wonder how the US military might divide its units based on specialties and skills, if these things were to come to pass. Because theoretically every soldier would be able to do everything. As we talked about earlier, special operations soldiers are differentiated on the granularity of human nuance, like perception and judgment, the internal engines behind the elite combat output. These are things that can't be replicated by machinery, although I suppose they can be enhanced, but that's also kind of dangerous. You know, we have to make sure that these qualities, these human qualities, are at the forefront because humanity is central to the battlefield unit. We don't want soldiers becoming drones because we know what happens when that comes to pass. I read something online a while ago that was kind of speculating about this, and it was about a car that drives itself, right? And say there was like uh, there was a hurricane or not a hurricane, but there was like a storm and there was a tree branch in the road ahead of you. And the question is whether or not the car would decide to swerve to the right, which would be potentially off the road, or swerve to the left, which is illegal and could put somebody else at risk. Would the car decide to kill you or kill somebody else? And that's like, I don't know. That's tough, man. Those are questions that we don't want to answer, but we do know are better in human hands, right? I suppose you could just stop. There's also that access to these military upgrades or implants will be inevitably walled off by the financial respects. I mean, we have a considerable budget for military spending, and America's army is the biggest and most powerful in history. But especially in the early days, I can't imagine cyborg technology being cheap. But here's the funny thing about that, which becomes less funny, is that we're already in those early days. You know how some people will say that we're living in the future? I suppose that comes from a very postmodern sensibility regarding art and society, but with the exception of flying cars and jetpacks, for the most part, yes, we are living out the visions of ancient dreamers. One such example would be the prosthetic limbs afforded to veterans that allow them to live their lives as unrestricted as possible following an amputation, or even allow them to continue serving. There's an amazing article in US News I found, it's a publication I'm not really familiar with, published in 2012, which states that according to the Army, at least 167 soldiers who have had a major limb amputation have remained on active duty since the start of the Afghanistan and Iraq wars, with some returning to battle. It goes on to discuss how innovations in artificial joints as well as the rehab are bettering the approximation, and I'd say that the results speak for themselves. However, there's the logistical element of power, where some of the more high-tech prosthetics operate on batteries, and at that point we're entering into an Evangelion scenario where soldiers would have to worry about running out of juice in a war zone. We can imagine that advancements down the road would eventually mitigate this concern, but I can't imagine how it would feel if, like, your arm ran out of battery. Like, what would that be like? And then, of course, these prosthetics are meant to replace and simulate, and the simulation is of what you were before, not of Superman. So we don't really have a mass market kind of heavy lift augmentation that we talked about before, but maybe it's possible one day, especially since in our modern day we can safely guess at trajectories based on past histories with technology, or as safer. But access to that level of bionics will inevitably be asymmetric. So in these hypothetical thoughts, I suppose primarily these units would be governed by the budget, and we'd still have quote-unquote better units with the more expensive equipment and training programs. But I also want to believe that individuation can happen on the individual level, because the whole budget thing kind of invokes anxiety akin to class division, and besides, the military is all about encouraging each soldier to be their best, so long as that doesn't come at the expense of the group, which is arguably more important. So as a soldier, you'll go off on your own and calibrate your newly mechanized body and all that. You'll have to try to understand it better than others understand their bodies, whether that means bettering your reflexes or honing motor controls to the smallest nuance. I say that word a lot. I mean, just thinking about like training rooms in these futuristic scenarios, like you wouldn't really see a cyborg with robot arms doing pull-ups. In the sci-fi anime Ghost in the Shell, the concept of cyborgs working out actually comes up, where the character Bato is always blowing his pay on workout equipment, which would seem largely useless for someone made of metal. But maybe it is more of that mental exercise, that Bato is training his mind more than his body. Because if you wanted to bulk yourself out, you'd just swap out parts. But what if you wanted to make the best use of parts that you were the most comfortable with, that you knew how best to control? Maybe swapping for something larger wouldn't always make you better. It would be linking your mind to your body, in a way that I suppose recalls Eastern martial arts philosophy, like Zen, becoming one whole unit, and for the sake of whatever that might mean for the application on the battlefield. I think that that'll play a big part, but of course, it's speculation. And yet, even for today, I can begin to see the utility. Because it's somewhat confusing, like, there is a standard for servicemen in combat roles, like Marines, where there's a series of physical tests that you have to pass sometimes, or some of these tests you take annually. And also there's a check at the beginning to ensure that you are within a certain metric of weight and fat. So there's a kind of ideal body they're looking for. But ideal isn't a linear thing, that you're better in general, just that the job is very physical and you have to be ideal for that job. You don't look at a platoon of soldiers and see the bigger guys and say, they must be the better soldiers, right? Ideal physical aptitude isn't linear either, where there's more to a soldier than the physiology. This is the more granular version of the philosophy behind Special Operations Forces soldiers who do more than iron sight and shoot. A Marine infantryman, to keep consistent with this example, whether rifleman or machine gunner, is trained to, as they say, locate, close with and destroy the enemy by fire and maneuver, or repel the enemy's assault by fire and close combat. So after the physical training, then you have the more specialized training at Camp Geiger in North Carolina or Camp Pendleton in California. That's where the deeper skills are honed, and that's where you become a soldier. But the results there, and the process, it's more invisible, just like a cyborg doing pull-ups. You don't see what's going on under the hood. You don't see what's going on under the hood, but it's how a smaller guy could be a more skilled soldier than a bigger guy, let's say, to use inexact terms. I don't know, it's just, this kind of thought process is always stuck in my mind, I guess, and I think it's because I'm one of these smaller guys. I have no aspiration to become a soldier or anything, but especially when I was younger, I used to think about my physical potential, and I didn't like the fact that because I'm kind of a small in stature person, bigger kids would always be better at sports or, something like that. It's true that if you have a guy who's 6'6", 350 pounds, then you're going to put him on the defensive line, and that's why we have weight classes in wrestling and professional fighting in general. I believe I'd qualify as featherweight in boxing. It just seems so cheap to me that the reason we have weight classes is because if I got into the ring with a heavyweight, or technically even a lightweight, the assumption is that I'd be destroyed. Assuming first that I know anything about boxing, of course. I know so little, in fact, that I guess that if you're bigger, then you throw a harder punch, and that's kind of the baseline. Like, that's what the people who created the weight classes, or the idea of weight classes, are worried about, because a lot of boxing is about getting those punches in. I suppose that the skill comes in with, like, maneuvering and playing that chess game, as well as maintaining stamina and taking hits and things. But what about something like MMA? Because with mixed martial arts, it's about putting styles into competition, so where we can say that boxing is slightly more quantitative with regards to physical supremacy, MMA wouldn't be. It would be even more so about that chess game. And that's where I find comfort. You can be small, but every time I make a reference to big or small, it's just penises every time. If you can excuse that, please. But as long as you train to optimize your body to the style and to fighting itself, which means speed, flexibility, and cardiovascular training, you can do anything. Like Bruce Lee. He's not a tall dude, but he had an insane relationship to his own body. I imagine that the kind of linking he did to mind and body is comparable to what one of these speculative cyborg soldiers is going to have to do in order to maximize themselves. And when you're the best you can be, and you're up against others who are the best they can be, no matter the size, at that point it becomes a purely mental game. That's the only factor left over. Can you outsmart the other guy? Can you strategize and get inside his head? Once MMA kind of came into its own, weight classes were introduced. In the early days, it was just about having fun, seeing if the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guy could beat the Muay Thai dude. But in the days of UFC and million-dollar contracts, you don't want to take any chances. Fighting is pretty violent, and there are consequences. So if you are a governing body of the sport, you'd want to mitigate those consequences. But then people like to speculate about the world's best fighters, and at that point, if you're going to do that, then you have to kind of throw out the concession to weight classes in these make-believe discussions. Believe me, I understand how important weight classes are. Though they are very stressful for high schoolers, I will also say that. My buddy back when was a wrestler, and he had all these tricks to cut weight like Jolly Ranchers. And of course, water weight, is the most important thing, or is the big one. It's pretty crazy, all the stuff that he came up with, or not that he came up with, but that he had to do. And I also think that it's borderline abusive that schools make wrestlers go to the cafeteria during lunch. But anyway, I don't mean to get too personal. That's a little glimpse inside my head, but overall I'd say it's a leveling of what cyborgs are and what they mean. We've laid the philosophical groundwork. Now all we need is for the technology to catch up. Coming off of cyborgs, then, the next part here is the internet. A central conceit to this cybernetic overhaul is the aspect of communication. In Black Ops 3, the DNI, or Direct Neural Interface, allows the kind of technological telepathy as we've seen in Ghost in the Shell. In that fictional universe, their DNI equivalent is the cyber brain, which almost everyone has depending on which side of the new socioeconomic divide you're on. So field agents, in this case elite police officers based on Germany's GSG-9, are able to remotely talk to one another without an external device, and even secure channels with individual people. What it means for the anime is that there's a lot of dialogue that requires no mouth movements. What it means for gamers is that you can kind of experience what that would be like in possibly a better Ghost in the Shell simulation than Ghost in the Shell Standalone Complex First Assault, another first-person shooter that released in 2015. It's not radio waves anymore, and a lot of Black Ops 3 is interfacing with, I think maybe it was. No, it's not. And a lot of Black Ops 3 is interfacing with networks and hacking into things. That's become a major pillar of warfare, what we call cyber warfare, and so it's kind of come full circle, where the internet originated as a project by the US military, ARPANET, and then came to encompass every facet of human experience, including military. Hacking is a major concern, and that's how in the game you take control of drones, not by sitting in a compound with that control console, but by hacking in remotely. Telepathy and machine empathy both, when man and machine are on the same frequency, so to speak. Now we're talking cyberpunk. These days, in America's war on terror, we're seeing the double-edged nature of global communication. The current threat, of course, is ISIS, which behaves a lot like a virus, working by spreading influence off of a cultural premise that it's going to establish an Islamic State based on its extremist beliefs. The group has actually existed in some form since 1999, when it joined up with Al-Qaeda, and then many years later merged with a group called Al-Nusra, and became the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant in 2013. By February of the next year, Al-Qaeda stepped away from it, and ISIS made its push into Iraq, demonstrating its considerable military strength, which made the US and the UN take notice. For people who try to keep up with a range of current events, ISIS is a pretty confusing thing. But one thing you always hear about is its use of social media. It might sound silly that a terrorist group is on Twitter, but social media is a staple in our lives, and in people's lives all over the world. It's become another pillar of human experience that insurgency, and then counterinsurgency, will deal with. ISIS will post images of executions, and they'll tweet about its record of operations, and post recruitment videos that go viral. It's the kind of stuff I'll read about secondhand because I fear the ramifications of typing in, ISIS recruitment video on YouTube. It's another front, and it's something that the US military has been engaging with for a while. Personnel are specialized in cyber warfare, and the soldiers in Black Ops 3 have this specialization built into their very bodies. It's a cutting-edge vision of the future, where the game creators are positing a solution to the problem that reaches beyond the scope of the problem. We can have soldiers who maneuver physical terrain while simultaneously maneuvering cyberspace, and so you in essence double the ground covered on which to gather intelligence, which is another opportunity born of horror. This is kind of like the purchase we get from investing in cyborgs, the ability to operate on levels before unseen or even uncreated. A cyborg soldier has so much versatility, reflecting the best of what we are now and the potential for what we can be tomorrow. The next consideration in Black Ops 3 is a pretty big one, the element of female soldiers in active combat roles. In this game, you fight alongside, against, and even as a female soldier, if that's your choice. I actually went with female this time because it's new for Call of Duty, and so I was curious to see how it would change things, and it really did not. Outside of the noises you make and your appearances in cutscenes, where your chosen face is rendered each time, you can pick from about 9 faces, and I don't really understand the purpose of that. In essence, you're beginning to define the purpose of character creation, and then not fulfilling any of those possible definitions. If the player wants to create something relatable, that option is open to him. If he wants to create a sexy lady, he can do that too. So it's either self-insertion or ideal image, which has a complete disconnect. But this character system does neither, so it might as well just have one character, since that's pretty much the result anyway. I mean, you can have both genders, but why have 18 different characters across? It just seems like Treyarch created more work for themselves than was necessary, in the spirit of competition with RPGs, where you can sit there moving sliders for an hour. I do that sometimes. But the introduction of this female character could be read as a concession to left-leaning tides, but it's also a reflection of a currently developing reality. Late last year, December 3rd, 2015, Secretary of Defense Ash Carter announced the end of the policy that bans military women from serving in combat roles. This measure has received a lot of support, but there are criticisms to be made. The oldest and most classic criticism, I guess, is that women would distract men in like a sexual way when they're supposed to be doing something else, that these soldiers who are trained and exhibit extreme discipline might take their minds off of the mission to ogle a fellow female soldier who was decked out in the same tack gear. Sexy, sexy tack gear. The persistent worries, however, are more serious, concerns coming from male soldiers who worry about the aptitude of women in these roles. In these life-or-death situations, can a male soldier depend on a female soldier to have his back? And, that's also a psychological game. The male soldier has to trust that the female soldier can have his back, regardless of whether or not she can. So that's really 2 barriers. And then there's a superficially similar issue that is important to make distinct, which is further down the aptitude road, the question of whether or not women are physically capable, just the same as men. It's one thing to make conjecture in a purely conceptual arena, but once those female soldiers make landfall, there are consequences we need to reconcile. Could they endanger fellow personnel, or put a mission at risk, or what have you? Strangely enough, though, that old criticism about being sexually distracted actually holds some water and becomes arguably the most serious consideration. This is something that women have spoken about, and what Ash Carter and Leon Panetta should review for the sake of prospective female soldiers. Writing for SOFREP, Special Operations Forces Report, a former service member in the military who is female, Desiree Hewitt, discusses how the coming change in policy will have unintended consequences that we can trace from things that have historically been going on. She cites how, before women enter into these traditionally male-occupied roles, the diminishing oversight garrisons appreciate once overseas leads to involvement in quote prostitution rings, sex tape, pornography, sexual assaults, and rape. To quote her directly, the potential risk for an increase in criminal behavior may subvert and undermine the intentions behind incorporating women into these roles. End quote. She goes on to say how pregnancies are a further issue, which could result in temporary loss of personnel, which, I don't think the military really tolerates days off during war. So how do we get from where we are now, just a month and change from that overturning the rule written in 1994, to the world of Black Ops 3, where women in combat roles are unsurprising and prevalent? And once we get there, the question becomes, should we? What will it really take? And is it possible? And then, of course, is it ethical? Well, I guess we can start with these criticisms, where the process of reaching that end goal as depicted in Black Ops 3 would have to address them and provide solutions. From what I can see, the foundational problem here, which branches off as symptoms in the other problems, is the aptitude question. I think that's where we should begin. The funny thing about this game, Black Ops 3, is that even if you play as a female character and you can see yourself in the cutscenes, the NPCs will still reference you with male pronouns, and so I have to assume that we're working from the base experience of the male avatar, and the female avatar was kind of grafted on. Some feminist critics might see this as treating the female character as a secondary concern. I just think it's funny. But I think it also illustrates what I mean by end goal. That how women would get what they want in this situation is by this kind of complete immersion, which we can visualize, I suppose, thanks to Black Ops 3. Women in this conversation put forth that they can do everything men can do, and thereby believe there to be no meaningful difference between the genders. I suppose that a part of that would be a dissolution of the concept of gender, or at least a severely diminished significance of the concept, to the point where any soldier would look at any other soldier and not think about who they are, just that they're a soldier, right? Like, that's probably what they're going for. And to think of it like that's kind of like separating it from gender or whatever. It's like, conceptually, that's what being a soldier is. You surrender a lot of who you are to be a part of something greater. You join up, and the point of the early training is to be broken down and built back up again, because being a soldier is such a superhuman thing that you really can't just wander into it off the streets, and your psychology has to change. You become a part of a new family, all that. So to begin here, I should just say that this discussion may upset people. Some people. People take offense to things. That's not my intention. I'm just trying to figure this stuff out and come to a few reasonable conclusions. Alright, okay. People say gender equality and kind of leave it at that, but men and women are not identical, certainly. And although equality brings with it a connotation of social balance, there are ways in which we are naturally unequal. So let's look at the biological and physiological foundation for that kind of term to settle this matter one way or the other. So you type differences between men and women into Google, and you're bound to get a lot of contradictory information and inexact figures. It's a sticky issue, and people on both sides bring agendas to it. And the fact of the matter is that there's a deficiency in the science at work here, at least where, say, psychology and brain science is concerned. But we've been over that. I mean, we learned a lot about the human brain when a guy took a railroad spike to the head, and he somehow lived as a human shish kebab. I mean, he was kind of messed up, but he wasn't dead. So forgive me if some of this stuff comes off as not completely factual, because science was not a huge part of my education, whether high school or college. Testament perhaps to the uselessness of the science fiction fan, that even in pursuing the second nerdiest genre, I learned nothing. There's a difference in skeletal structure. Women have a shorter head, broader face, and this is something, apparently women's index fingers are usually longer than the middle fingers. I never noticed. Primarily this info comes from the blog of one Dr. James Dobson, who I trust because he's a doctor. Women have a larger stomach, larger kidneys, liver, and appendix, but smaller lungs, 30% less lung capacity than men. And according to Weight Watchers, who I suppose they would know, men can eat more than women without gaining weight and also lose weight faster. sore subject, no doubt. But there's a relative metabolic difference such that women's energy expenditure is a little bit lower than men's. They say that this has to do with the difference in body composition. I guess some might know that as BMI. But apparently because of this slower metabolism, women can withstand high temperatures better. Men are more susceptible to disease, but women tire more easily and are more prone to fainting. This is because women's blood contains less red cells, which supply oxygen to the body. Those are definitely differences to be reconciled, but nothing really stands out yet. I think that for me, the foremost physical difference between men and women is that women can be pregnant. As a scientific layperson, I come at this very simply and just ask why there is such a dramatic sexual dimorphism in the Homo sapien. We are designed this way for a reason, whether by God or by the trial and error of evolution, but why wouldn't every human have both sets of sex organs? Wouldn't that make more sense for propagating the species, or just all animals, not just human beings? But wouldn't that make more sense to, I don't know. Maybe there's some anatomical compromise that happens, like you can't overload, don't overdo things, or maybe it's that one body type is more vulnerable and the other isn't. I mean, when I think about humanity in such a disaffected way like this, my mind is picturing a primeval scene, ancient, cavemen huddling by the fire. In this land that time forgot, there are hunters and things like that. A world without civilization is a good model for visualizing this kind of thing. What are we without the dressings of modern sensibilities? What are we really? Well, let's see. Pregnancy, as well as lactation and menstruation, influences hormones in women, and hormones are a thing with women. We tend to connect them with changes in mood, another sore subject. Like Kindergarten Cop, men have testosterone and women have estrogen. More specifically, women have estrogen and progesterone, as well as a little bit of testosterone, which influences the sex drive. For men, testosterone promotes such characteristics as increased muscle and bone mass. This is coming back to body composition, which the Weight Watchers outlined as the amount of muscle, bone, and fat that make up the body. They say that a typical man in his 20s who weighs 154 pounds has 69 pounds of muscle, 23 pounds of bone, and 23 pounds of fat, where a typical woman of the same age who weighs 125 pounds will have 45 pounds of muscles, 15 pounds of bone, and 34 pounds of fat. Is that are bones really that lightweight? Ugh. I don't know why that's weird, but it is. But putting aside the specificity of the figures there, it is common knowledge that men have more muscle than women. We attribute that, as well as the growth of hair, to testosterone. It's harder for women to develop muscle, and muscle is something you need in the military. I think that no matter what, and this is kind of crazy, but in this way, men and women will always be unequal. And I'm sorry if that offends you. That's not my intent. It's really just science. It's huge, it's a huge difference, and it does matter in recruitment. Because if we're looking at it philosophically, obviously we have caveats when we talk about the average male and female. Weight Watchers defines the typical 20-something guy as someone who weighs 154 pounds. I weigh 130, so that doesn't apply to me. Then there are 20-something guys who are a lot heavier, and then guys who are even lighter. Averages have their utilities of looking broadly at populations, people as numbers, but we are all individual people, right? You can't make blanket statements about all men or all women. However, you can when you're talking about the military, because there are certain requirements that need to be met, and these demand a standard of the body. The concern is that these standards will be lowered for the inclusion of women, and that's a big problem, understandably so. You don't want to compromise the integrity of a force just for the sake of inclusion. That's about as damaging as affirmative action is going to get. One recruitment process that does have unequal terms is the U.S. Marines, which makes sense because up until recently, there was a ban on women entering combat roles. So they had to meet a standard, but not the final standard, If you're out there listening to this, and if you're unfamiliar with the requirements for Marine eligibility, I'll go ahead and review them for you. Try to think about if you could do these things, and if not, where your limit lies. And at that point, is it something you can train at and eventually overcome? So we have these 3 physical tests that every aspiring recruit takes, regardless of the eventually desired MOS, or military occupational specialty. The first is the initial strength test, which is proof of very base standards, and you need to show up to training well above these minimum standards, which are on the level of high school gym class. The first thing here is the pull-ups / flexed arm hang. Each test is divided male and female, and so for males, they do pull-ups, and you do 2 pull-ups. For females, you hang there for 12 seconds. Number 2 is crunches. This one is actually unisex, and you do 44 crunches in 2 minutes, which sounds like a lot, but so too is 2 minutes. Even still, I don't think I could do that. Pull-ups were my thing, but my core is weak. Number 3 is the timed run, where the distance is unisex. It's 1.5 miles, but males have to complete it in 13 minutes and 30 seconds, and and females have to complete it in 15 minutes. This is the last test. The run is the last of the 3 things, but if you happen to fail the first 2, you'll be retested afterward. Do those 2 pull-ups. Next is the physical fitness test, which all Marines are required to pass on an annual basis. This one gets a little bit tougher. Number 1, pull-ups / flexed arm hang. Guys have to do 2 sets of 20 pull-ups each, 1 set underhand and the other overhand, which is crazy because that one's a lot harder. Females here are still doing the flexed arm hang, but they're encouraged to practice pull-ups and be able to do the 20 both ways because, it's a standard measure of physical fitness, and at that level, standards become more important. And then number 2, crunches. This one is a little confusing because they don't say what the test is, just how to prepare for the test, like some recommendations. They say, try doing 3 maximum effort sets, resting 60 to 90 seconds between each set, and then 6 20-second sets of as much as you can, resting 25 seconds between each set there, and then 50 repetitions as fast as possible. Rest for 60 seconds and then do 30 as fast as possible, rest for 45 seconds, and then 20 as fast as possible. I guess that's kind of nice that the number goes down each time, but I'm sure it's small consolation when you're actually doing it. Number 3, timed run. Male recruits have to complete a 3-mile run in 28 minutes or less, and females have 31 minutes. Finally, you have the combat fitness test, a 300-point test with an emphasis on functional fitness related to operational demands. In this one, males and females are performing the same exercises, but are scored differently. Number 1 is called the movement to contact, an 880-yard dash that tests endurance, and so men have 2 minutes and 45 seconds to do it, and women have 3 minutes and 23 seconds. Number 2, ammunition lift. Males have to lift a 30-pound ammo can overhead until elbows lock out, and they do this 91 times, and women do it 61 times. This is getting hard. Number 3 and final is maneuver under fire, a 300-yard shuttle run incorporating crawls, carries, ammunition resupply, grenade throwing, and agility running. Men have 2 minutes and 14 seconds, women have 3 minutes and 1 second. So, you think you could do it? I mean, you have to train for a long time, from the sitting down position of playing Black Ops 3 on your couch, but I don't know, depending on who you are and where you are with your life, maybe this is tangible. And obviously for a lot of people it is. If for the most part the relevant physiological differences in men and women for recruitment are muscles and the red blood cell deficiency, which I pick out as the biggest problems, I don't know if I really see the need for the test to be continued on in this way, scored differently for men and women. I mean, think about it from both sides. It's not really fair for men, because again, you need the men to feel comfortable trusting the female soldiers to have their back, and that demands the female soldier is equal, passes the same test. But I suppose that's a debatable point. You could argue either side how much weight the differences in the male and female body play in this series of tests. Because we don't really know either way until more women take these tests where there's only one standard, so it's still up in the air, even in a philosophical arena. But then there's the Crucible, which is week 11 of recruit training, the final test and culmination of everything that's come before. It sounds like a hell of a thing because it's founded on 54 continuous hours with little food and sleep. To quote them directly, to complete this final test, recruits must have the heart and the intestinal fortitude, the body and the mind, the desire, and the ability. The recruits must pull together or fall apart. Now that's a full spectrum of requirements that best illustrates aptitude for being a soldier. It's more than, what you can do with your increased muscles. It's requiring more of your body, as well as an intense willpower and the ability to communicate and work together as a team. In fact, week 5 of this recruit training is martial arts, so we're back at the MMA thing. Even though the muscle mass problem is overcome in the holistic, the more abstract application of muscle mass, which is linear power, is matched by skill and control over the body, which is something that has a base in natural talent, but can be improved with practice, so can be achieved by anyone, and thus has no upper natural or physiological limit. Meaning that I could do it if I had the willpower. And that's crazy. I really like that, It's almost inspiring. It's not going to inspire me to do anything, but it makes me feel better, I guess. And so also I imagine that there are women out there with that willpower that I lack, and it seems like they could do it. Based on this narrative of evidence, I choose to believe that no human standard is above a generalization of men or women, simply because you're just working with too large of populations to make broad conclusions about, Aptitude for the military should be decided on an individual basis, certainly not on a 50-50 across what seems to be the mostly arbitrary line of gender. Alright, we made it. That'll do it for this edition of the Battle Beyond Planet X. If you liked this episode, I'd invite you to stay tuned for the next episode, which will be kind of a follow-up, also talking about Black Ops 3. If you made it this far, thank you. But if you made it this far and also disagree with the episode's content, I then invite you to shoot me an email at battlebeyondpodcast@gmail.com or leave an comment on the blog at battlebeyondpodcast.com. I got the first one right. Yeah, at gmail.com, where you can lodge a formal complaint, and I'll be sure to get back to you. That's really all I'm trying to do here, is just start a conversation about the things that are interesting to me. As a fan of military science fiction, I would love to hear from you, because this is my 76th episode, and I've received one email in all my time. It was a good one, but I'd like to get more perspectives, especially on this matter. In the next episode, I'll be addressing a question that may or may not have come up with regards to the last section about women in the military. I ask, how much weight do the differences in the male and female body play in this series of tests for Marine recruitment? And I had concluded, no weight at all. So if that's true, why don't more women make the effort to join up then? Tune in next time if you're still interested, and regardless, thank you for your time.